In 1981, there were 7 of these birds left on Earth. Every survey conducted over the previous 2 decades had come back empty. Scientists had concluded the species was gone. What happened over the next 45 years is one of the most unlikely recoveries in conservation history. And it started with one man walking into a valley that wasn't on anyone's list. He was there to confirm an absence, not document a presence. Then he looked up. On May 23, 1981, a Chinese ornithologist named Liu Yinzheng was walking through a remote valley in the Qinling mountains of Shaanxi province. 2 adult pairs and 3 fledglings, perched in a pine tree on a hillside no survey team had ever reached. White plumage faintly pink at the wingtips. A long red-tipped bill curving down toward the ground. A crest of white feathers trailing behind the head. No alarm calls, no sudden flight. Just 7 birds going about an ordinary morning, unaware they were the last of anything. In 1981, those 7 birds were all that was left anywhere on the planet. Liu Yinzheng sent a report to Beijing. The news reached Japan a few weeks later, at a research center in Tokyo, where scientists had spent years mourning a species they believed was already gone. The message arrived like something from a different world. 7 birds in a valley nobody had checked. The species had been hiding there the whole time. No one had told them to stay. No one had told them this hillside would be the last place on Earth where they existed. They had simply kept nesting where Crested Ibis had always nested, in the same pine trees above the same rice paddies, waiting for someone to find them. The Crested Ibis didn't disappear suddenly. It contracted. At the turn of the 20th century, this bird, Nipponia nippon, literally Japan bird of Japan, ranged across a vast arc of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Russia's Far East. It nested in tall trees near wetlands, fed by probing shallow water for frogs, fish, and crayfish, and moved between traditional breeding grounds season after season. By the end of the century, the species named for Japan would be saved by China. Then, the 20th century happened all at once. Deforestation took the tall trees it needed for nesting. Agricultural modernization drained the wetlands into something more productive and far less hospitable. Pesticides spread across East Asian farmland and killed the frogs, fish, and invertebrates the ibis depended on to survive. A bird that feels for living prey in shallow water cannot survive in fields treated with organochlorines. Hunting added pressure on top of habitat loss, and the bird's preference for nesting in plain sight, high and tall trees, made it an easy target wherever guns reached. By the 1930s, the species was gone from Korea and Russia. By the 1950s, gone from most of Japan. By the 1960s, Chinese zoologists searching for it presumed it extinct. Japan captured its last 5 wild birds in 1981, hoping to breed them in captivity. They never reproduced. Japan's last wild crested ibis, a bird named Qin, died in October 2003. The most important conservation decision of the 20th century for this species was a footpath. Within weeks of Liu Yinzheng's report reaching Beijing, the valley was placed under protection. Pesticide use in the surrounding rice paddies was banned overnight. Local farmers were asked to return to traditional, low-intensity agriculture, the kind that kept the water shallow and full of fish. Nest trees were identified and guarded. Volunteers watched through the breeding season, chasing off predators, stepping in when chicks struggled. The 7 wild birds were never removed from the wild. That would have risked the only breeding population left on the planet. Instead, researchers collected surplus eggs from nests that had more than one, hatching them by hand while the parent pairs raised the rest. The crested ibis is so sensitive to disturbance that a pair will abandon a nest mid-incubation if approached too closely, leaving eggs to die. So researchers watched from ridgelines with binoculars and timed every check to the brief windows when adults were away foraging. The first years were not reassuring. In 1981, the wild population was 7. In 1982, it was still essentially 7. There was no second population anywhere to fall back on. If a storm, a predator, or one bad season went wrong in that valley, it went wrong for the entire species. The program had no safety net. By the early 1990s, the population had climbed past 20, and it was doing something nobody had scripted. New nesting sites began appearing outside the original valley. Birds were moving into adjacent terrain and breeding there on their own. The 7 had become a population. That long curved bill isn't built for spearing fish, it's built for probing. The ibis wades into shallow water, sinks its bill into the mud, and feels for prey. Frogs, small fish, crayfish, earthworms. It can't hunt in deep water. It can't hunt in dry fields. It needs one very specific kind of landscape. Traditional rice paddies, unpoisoned, flooded shallow through the winter, full of the small animals that modern intensive farming had wiped out. When researchers started mapping the population's movements, they found something that reshaped the entire strategy. The ibis wasn't just using the paddies as a convenient food source, it depended on them entirely. Every territory was centered on traditional fields. Every nest's success traced back to how much winter-flooded rice sat within reach. Saving the bird wasn't really about the bird. It was about protecting a way of farming the modern world had been abandoning for decades. It's a little like the last surviving copy of a forgotten book, kept alive only because it sat untouched in a village too small and too poor to ever build a library that might have thrown it out. The very neglect that should have doomed it is what preserved it. And keeping that book alive meant keeping the whole village reading the old way. So the program started paying farmers to do exactly that. Subsidies, organic certification. By the 2000s, rice grown under the Crested Ibis brand in Shaanxi County was selling at a premium that more than made up for the lower yield. The conservation subsidy had quietly turned into a market. The ibis had made itself economically necessary to the very people it needed to survive. The farmers, it turned out, could be brought back. China wasn't the only country with a stake in this. Japan, the country that had given the species its name and used it as a symbol of national identity for centuries, had nothing left. Its last 5 captive birds had died without reproducing, and kin was already gone. In 1999, China donated a breeding pair to restart Japan's program. What followed took almost a decade to set up. Sado Island, the bird's last Japanese stronghold, had been intensively modernized through the post-war decades, and its shallow, fish-filled paddies had largely vanished. Reversing that meant negotiating with hundreds of individual farmers, building a certification system for traditional Sado rice, and asking an island where most people had never seen a wild toki in their lifetime to bring the bird back anyway. It was the same playbook that had worked in Shaanxi, run in reverse, in a country that had already lost the bird once. In September 2008, 10 captive-bred crested ibis were released on Sado Island, 27 years after Japan lost its last wild bird. National television covered it. The Environment Minister attended. Some of the people watching had spent decades working toward that exact moment and weren't sure they would live to see it. The early releases didn't go cleanly. Some birds wandered toward paddies that hadn't been restored yet. Some didn't survive their first winter. Researchers adjusted, shifted release timing to spring, and selected birds with stronger wild instincts. Then, in 2012, wild-born chicks appeared on Sado Island, the first crested ibis hatched in the wild in Japan in 36 years. Not captive-bred, not hand-raised. Wild birds, born to parents who had themselves been born behind fences, learning to forage in paddies that hundreds of farmers had spent years preparing. The chicks didn't know they were historic, they were just hungry. From there, the climb is almost hard to believe, and it didn't happen in one leap. It compounded decade after decade for 40 years straight. By the end of 2025, The population that began with 7 birds had passed 12,000, spread across 15 provincial-level regions in China. The IUCN has since downlisted the species from critically endangered to endangered. Korea began its own reintroduction too, releasing birds at the Upo wetland with stock China had donated. 2026 marks the 45th anniversary of Liu Yinzheng's walk up that valley, and this past May, 10 birds were sent to Longshan in Fujian province, the species' first return there since it vanished from the region decades ago. An animal that once existed in a single tree now occupies a range spanning 3 countries. None of it happened because of a decision anyone made. The species survived because 2 pairs of crested ibis happened to be nesting in a valley too remote for surveys and too poor for pesticides to ever reach. The same poverty that left the rice paddies unflooded with chemicals. The same remoteness that left the hillside trees unlogged. All of it, which should have counted as disadvantage, became the thing that kept the species alive. And it isn't fully saved. Every bird alive today descends from those original 7, and a 2026 study confirms the population still carries the genetic fragility of that bottleneck, vulnerable to inbreeding in ways that decades of growth can't fully undo. The win is real. It just isn't finished. I keep coming back to the moment Liu Yinzheng looked up. He wasn't looking for living birds. He was there to confirm an extinction, fill in the last blank on a survey form, and go home. One path, one day, one ornithologist who kept walking when he could have turned back a kilometer earlier. If he had, none of the rest of this exists. If you want more stories where the margin between survival and extinction came down to something this small, subscribe. Next week, a different species, a different landscape, and a discovery that came even later, after the scientists had already given up.